Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jay, and I am a naval and military historian. And you are joining me in part three of a multi-part series that take us to the end of the year, in which I covered the history of military thought, strategy, tactics, weaponry, and all that jazz. And so today we're going to talk about the introduction of gunpowder into first China and then spread out through the Middle East and Europe, and how that affected the development of various armies, and how that led to, by the end of the 18th century, the foundations for what would be today's combined armed forces. And so, with that, let's get started. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Turks confirmed that gunpowder based weapons were the future of warfare. The daily barrage from Turkish heavy and medium artillery against the city walls and the usage of lighter artillery against targets of opportunity had not only weakened the defenses of the Byzantine capital, but also terrorized the defenders and severely weakened their morale. The defenders of Constantinople also had gunpowder weapons, but their supplies of the compound and rounds to fire against their attackers quickly ran out, and they were forced to use swords, spears, and arrows to defend themselves by the end of the 55-day campaign. It should be noted that by the mid 15th century, gunpowder was not a new invention, but one that was several hundred years old. The first formulas for gunpowder can be dated to the 9th century Tang Dynasty China, with the classic and most effective formula being in wide usage by the next century in the dynasty, which was the Song Dynasty. Saying this, the legend of Mulan actually originated around the same time as the uh, development of gunpowder, so there being fireworks and gunpowder weapons in that film would not be uh, would actually be very chronologically accurate for that. While the popular conception is that the earliest use of gunpowder was for fireworks, the chemical was also used to propel fire arrows, which were used by the Middle Kingdom's army against, see the film Mulan. The use of gunpowder for both celebrations and war would spread throughout Asia until the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, beginning with the vassal states of China, namely Korea, Indochina, and the numerous Southeast Asian islands, then by the enemies of the Middle Kingdom, namely Japan, and finally to regions west. Now, despite having those gunpowder based weapons, it did not stop the fall of the Song dynasty to the invading Mongol hordes, as the vast majority of these weapons would be considered artillery pieces today and had long reloading times, thus making them ineffective against swift moving formations of light cavalry. But the fall of China to the Mongols and the establishment of the Yuan dynasty did not mean that gunpowder would fall into use. Instead, it was during this dynasty of Mongol rule in which traders from the Middle East and Venice, allegedly beginning with Marco Polo, began to establish new trading routes between the Mediterranean and China. In addition to bringing silks, spices, and tea to the West, gunpowder was also introduced to Europe, Turkey, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula around this time. The earliest usage of gunpowder in Europe was in barrels placed in tunnels that were dug underneath castle or city walls by an attacking force in order to destroy them. As digging tunnels was both time consuming and could lead to the deaths of the tunnelers, mostly by accidents, Europeans and Middle Eastern armies soon used cannons that could launch a projectile into the defenses of their enemy from a safe distance. The first cannons were imported from China, but quickly blacksmiths and metallurgists began to forge their own weapons. The earliest recorded use of these early cannons in Europe can be dated to the 14th century, and records show that they were in wide use by both the English and the French during the entirety of the Hundred Years' War. Essentially, the late medieval introduction of gunpowder was the beginning of the end of construction or castle construction, as new fortifications would need to be developed to absorb the firepower of these weapons. Now, because cannons are inherently cumbersome to maneuver, especially during these earlier centuries, the musket was developed nearly simultaneously across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia as a way to increase firepower for their available armies. The earliest muskets, such as this arquebus, the earliest muskets came into use during the first half of the 15th century, in time for them to be used during the waning years of the Hundred Years' War, and were also in use by both the defenders of Constantinople and their attackers. While these smaller weapons were more maneuverable, it still took a two-man team to use each one due to the weight of the early muskets, and they also took time to reload after each round was fired. So during the 15th and 16th century, archers were gradually replaced by musketeers who still had to be protected by traditional sword and spear infantry. Naturally, sailors wanted the firepower, the gunpowder weapons on board their ships too, in spite of the weight of the early cannons. Indeed, as part of the mass adaptation of muskets by many nations was not just to provide firepower in an easier to move package on the battlefield, but also to arm their ships as they were lighter than cannon. Thus, the early years of the Spanish conquest of America featured the musket as the chief heavy weapon used by the conquistadors and not the cannon. And it would not be until the latter half of the 16th century before metallurgists had developed light enough cannons to be used as ships, as seen in the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English Royal Navy. It is safe to state that the introduction of gunpowder changed warfare forever. Despite the slow reloading times of the cannons and muskets, and the need to protect the artillerymen and musketeers by spearmen, pikemen, and lancers, the destructive firepower that these weapons brought to the field made the investment in these weapons worth the cost. It was no longer enough for a commander to be a great tactician, but they also needed to bring the right amount of firepower with them to gain the upper hand. Yet the commanders of the 14th through 17th century were only laying the foundation of what was to come. As we will see in the next section, it was the 18th century that bore the fruits of the developments of military ideas and technology of the previous centuries. Therefore, as the 17th century came to a close, the last of the traditional spear and pike equipped infantry units were either phased out or given muskets as their primary weapon. A major factor in this was not the accuracy of the musket, which was iffy within 100 meters of the target and non existent from ranges over 100 meters, but the development of the bayonet. Essentially, a bayonet is a bladed instrument that has a round connector on its hilt that allows it to be attached to the muzzle of a musket. Therefore, with a bayonet attached to the musket, an infantryman would be able to use his weapon first to fire upon his enemy when they were at range, and then use the weapon as a spear in close quarters combat. In essence, the need for pikemen and lancers to protect the musketeers was eliminated, as the latter could protect themselves using their musket and bayonet. Now, the bayonet, combined with the legendary brown bess musket, became the weapon that enabled the British Empire to rise to its original height during the 18th century. By assembling the infantry in companies and battalions in long lines of men with bayonets on their uh, muskets, fixed on muskets, with captains and lieutenants issuing orders both vocally and with their sabers, these units were able to fire their weapons only at the command of their officers and to great effect despite the poor accuracy of the muskets. The volume of muskets being fired simultaneously, not the accuracy of the infantryman's aim, was what was deadly to opposing formation. Additionally, metallurgy had advanced to the point that by the 18th century, cannons were not only stronger and could safely handle heavier rounds of shot, but were also consistently mass produced, so there were very little difference in the accuracy and range between any two guns. More importantly, the cannons of the 18th century were light enough to be easily towed by a single horse, allowing armies to always have artillery support for the infantry in every battle. And, and while a single mass volley of musket fire from a company of infantry was deadly, the artillery blast from a cannon was completely devastating to a formation. If one was not killed outright by the cannon fire, then they would be seriously maimed and be taken out of action. Furthermore, cavalry units became an important unit for a field leader to utilize on the battlefield and in a campaign. When an army was on the march, the cavalry would be used to scout ahead of the main army for the enemy, and as a flying squadron to protect the weaker parts of the column, namely the artillery batteries and the supply chain, especially during an ambush. During battle, during the battle, the scouting role of the cavalry continued, but with a focus on exploiting any weaknesses in the enemy's lines. Finally, a commander could use the cavalry to uh, pursue a fleeing enemy after the artillery and infantry had broken those lines. Essentially, the combined arms use the use of the combined arms of infantry, cavalry, and artillery in one army became the standard of all European armies during the 18th century, of which the British and Prussians would demonstrate their mastery of during the Seven Years' War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763. Furthermore, this basic combined arms formation continues to this day to be the foundation of every modern conventional army, regardless of size. While I plan on going into more detail later on this in the series, the 18th century also saw the majority of the Golden Age of sail and the Golden Age of piracy. The availability of lighter cannons meant that the navies could build fighting ships of the line, which had several decks of guns ready to be used in a broadside attacks against enemy ships or fleets. In regards to protecting the shipping lanes from piracy and to scout for enemy fleets, smaller ships, known as frigates, brigs, and schooners, were deployed. At the time, these were collectively known as cruisers with a Z in the middle, and it's and just in case you see that while you're going through your favorite history book. And I should also note that, contrary to popular belief, most pirates during this era were actually privateers, and they had acquired a license of marque from uh, one state to attack the merchantmen of whoever their enemy they were fighting at that time. The British and then later the United States Navy itself were especially fond of using privateers to attack merchantmen, as this fleet freed up the Royal Navy to focus on their enemy fleets and, and not having to go on convoy attack missions. It was out of the stability of 18th century military tactics, in which arguably the most successful field commander of all time emerged from, and would inspire the two greatest thinkers on military strategy during the first decades of the 19th century who penned their treatises: Napoleon, Clausewitz, and Jomini. And eventually, the war that best demonstrated the influence of these writings, the American Civil War. Now, I hope you like that. Please share this with someone that you also think will like this. Feel free to subscribe and like. And also, if you want to leave a comment, please be kind when you respond to everyone. It's a short life. Let's just be kind. It's so much easier. And with that, I'll be back next week, in which like I said, we will be talking about Napoleon, Jomini, Clausewitz, and the American Civil War. And until then, I hope you have a good week. Bye bye.